Okay, we are online and we're ready to get started. So good evening, everybody. Good evening. Good to see you. I could say happy fall, y'all. It's feeling like fall weather out there, isn't it? You liking that? Yeah, did you like that nice crisp morning? Yes. If I'd had time, I was really tempted to take my coffee mug outside and sit for a while, but didn't have time to do it. So it is good to see you and glad to have you joining us. Got more of a crowd back here on Wednesday evening. Last week was kind of lean. Don said, not teaching Revelation on Wednesday night changes things, doesn't it? So, but I know a lot was going on, and folks were out of town. We've got our Globetrotters back, so we're glad to have the Globetrotters back, safe and sound. And they're glad to be back, aren't you? Yeah. Yes.
We were in Luxembourg. We thought they brought out a bunch of TV cameras because we were there.
Now, wait a minute. For those online, Daryl just said that they were in Luxembourg and they brought out TV cameras because they were all there. All right?
And to make a long story short, it turned out it was the Pope.
So the reality is they had the cameras out for the Pope coming the next day. You found out you weren't he, right? All right, we're glad you had a good time. We got some newlyweds here, Mark and Linda Sue. Congratulations to them. Glad to have them with us this evening. All right, so if you would, let's go ahead and get into our Bible study. We're in 1 Samuel chapter number 2. Even though we got a few that might not have been with us in the last week or two, most of us are familiar enough with 1 Samuel, and especially the early chapters, that you pretty well know what's going on and what's been taking place. But today we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 2, which we were in the first portion of chapter 2 last week. We're going to be finishing up the second chapter today. We want to go ahead and do just a little bit of review of what we talked about last week. And of course, everybody, I think, is familiar enough. The first chapter of 1 Samuel deals with the issue of Hannah being barren, Peninnah having multiple children and provoking and just pouring salt into the wound, and Elkanah, Hannah's husband, trying to be understanding but not quite getting it, that there was just some things he couldn't do for her that she needed, and which she desperately wanted to be a mother, and she wanted to give him a child, wanted to give him a son. And so one of the things we find, and we end in chapter 1 of 1 Samuel with Hannah praying. And it's a heart-wrenching prayer. And she's pleading with God. God, bless me, let me have a child, let me have a son. And of course, she goes to her home, and in time she conceives, and she's made this promise. Remember, she made that commitment. Lord, I'm going to give this child back to you. And so we come to chapter 2. Remember that in between are several years that pass, because the custom of the family was that annually they would travel from where they lived to Shiloh, which is where the tabernacle was located. They would go and they would make their offerings and so forth. There was a feast. There was an offering feast that took place there during that period of time. But Hannah said, I will not be going back until I've weaned my son Samuel. And she knew that when that time came, that she would be leaving Samuel there in the care of Eli. So a period of several years passed before she went back, okay? So that brings us to chapter 2, because what we find in chapter number 2 is that it begins with another prayer of Hannah. Except this time it's a prayer of a different tone, and that's what we looked at last week. Couple of things just to hit some highlights is that in verses 1 and 2 we see that she is rejoicing, whereas in chapter number 1 she had a heavy heart, a burdened heart. In chapter 2 verses 1 and 2 she's rejoicing. She says, my heart rejoices, my horn is exalted in the Lord. No one's holy like the Lord. There's no one beside you. There's no God like no rock like our God. So she's rejoicing, even though she knows that when she leaves, she's going to be leaving her son behind, but yet she's rejoicing. And she's also confident. She expresses in verses 3 through 10 confidence in God's sovereignty, his justice. She also expresses her confidence in the future. So you see a completely different mindset with Hannah from chapter 1 to chapter 2. We also find in chapter number 2 at verse number 11, as she's going through all this prayer, the focus is on Hannah. In verse number 11, we find it says, then Elkanah went to his house at Ramah, meaning that he was there with her and he was in agreement with what was going on. And so we talked about last week, that was a big thing even on his part. Kelly Wills came up to me after service last week and she reminded me of something I didn't mention, but it's very true. In that culture, so it's a big deal that Elkanah, Hannah's husband, is on board with all of this. Because in that culture, mom, she has the children. She would wean the children, especially the son, in the early years. Then it became the father's role of training him. So you see that Elkanah is giving a lot here as well in this sacrifice that's being made and giving Samuel to the Lord. And then, of course, those verses conclude, verse number 11 concludes like this in chapter 2. But the child ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest. So even after she leaves him, goes back home and leaves Samuel with Eli early on. And there again, he can't be more than probably, I would say 5, probably at the most, somewhere in that neighborhood. Because obviously he would have been weaned by that time, if not sooner. But the idea that the statement is that he ministered to the Lord before Eli, even at that age, says much about the training he received with his mother while she had him as well. So this evening, that brings us to the following verses of chapter 2, which is verses 12 through 36. And so we're going to begin in looking at verses 12 through 21, and here's what we see. So if you got the outline, follow along here, because there's a number of different things in the outline that we're going to hit on. So here's what we begin with. So Samuel has been left with Eli. For Eli to help him grow in the Lord, teach him how to serve as a priest before the Lord. And so what we find, we start out with this contrast between Samuel and the sons of Eli. Because we've already been told in chapter 1, there's a problem with Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, right? And so we see these contrasts that play out. So there's 3 things we're going to be talking about as far as Eli's sons are concerned. So there's 3 offenses. The first offense of Eli's son is this. The biggest, I would dare say, all right? And that is this. They did not know the Lord. Verse number 12 of chapter 2 says this. Now the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord. Now, I would dare say that as a priest, that's a problem, right? That's about equivalent to finding out, hey, guess what? The preacher's not saved, That's a big deal. And so it says the sons of Eli were corrupt. Now, here's an interesting thing. If you get back into the Hebrew, the English translators have translated it to say the sons of Eli were corrupt, okay? If you get back into the Hebrew, what it says is the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. Now, you've heard that name before, right? Who is or what was Belial? Remember? A pagan god. A pagan Canaanite god. This is Belial, but they're all part of the same bunch, okay? Kind of all out of the fertility gods and all that sort of thing, okay? And so basically, here's what that means. To say that sons of Belial, you could basically essentially say sons of the devil. All right? But what it meant was this. It said that they are men who are considered to be worthless and wicked men. And these are the guys that are serving alongside their father, who Eli is the high priest. And they're serving alongside. And by the way, they're actually in line to serve in their father's place as high priest. Hophni first, he's named first, likely the elder. And then, of course, Phinehas after him if something were to happen to him. But they're both already functioning as priests before God at the temple. And so it says, first of all, that's bad enough, right? To say they're corrupt, they're worthless, wicked men. But then the real clincher is they did not know the Lord. So now look at this. Here's their father, Eli, he's the high priest. He's already, and we'll see this more in just a few moments, he's already to the age to where he really can't function and do the job. So his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are in there basically doing what he should be, but he's not able to do. And I would dare say maybe one of the reasons why he's hanging on is because he knows his sons are worthless men. But he's the high priest, all right? But here's the thing. Just because their father is the high priest, guess what? Knowing the Lord, or in our terminology today, salvation is not something that is passed on genetically, biologically. You know, no kid, no preacher's kid or deacon's kid or anybody, no Christian's children can say, well, guess what? My mom and my dad, boy, they're just great godly people. And because they are, that must mean I'm saved. Now, there was a time, I'm not sure it's around very much anymore today in the situation that the United States is in, but there was a time when America identified as a Christian nation. There were people who actually believed that because I was born in America and I'm a citizen in America and America is a Christian nation, that means what? I'm a Christian. Nothing to it, right? Same thing with these guys. They needed to personally know the Lord. Now, apparently, the implication here is that their father, Eli, knew the Lord. Now, we're going to talk more about him as father and all that sort of thing here in a few moments. But his sons needed to know the Lord. Especially if they're going to be serving in that capacity. They needed to know the Lord just for their own soul's sake, let alone for the role that they're in. Just like today, people need to know the Lord personally for their soul's sake. But especially if you're going to be in the position of being a spiritual leader among Christians, you need to have a relationship with the Lord, and not just a nominal, casual relationship. It needs to be vital and real and genuine. Otherwise, you can't have an impact on somebody else. So that's the first offense that we see. All right, here's the second offense of Eli's sons. They stole what was offered to God. They stole what belonged to God. All right, look at verse number 13. And the priest's custom with the people. Now, let me say something real quick. Notice it says the priest's custom. This was not God's custom. What you're about to read here is not what is prescribed in Leviticus and so forth about the portions for the priest. All right? So it says, and the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged flesh hook. You kind of get the picture, don't you? Like a big treble hook. And says he would come along with this flesh hook in his hand. While the meat was boiling, he would thrust it into the pan, kettle, cauldron, pot, whatever it was that they were stewing it in. And the priest would take for himself all that the flesh hook brought up. So they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Now what's being described here is this, okay? So here's kind of the way it works. when they would go and they would make an offering to the Lord there at the tabernacle, at the temple in Jerusalem later, there were basically three divisions of a sacrifice, okay? There was the portion that was God's, okay? There was the portion that was assigned to the priest, because remember something, the priests weren't given territory, farms, all that sort of stuff. They were to live in Levitical cities. They were to take care of their duties and responsibilities as priests without distraction of all the other stuff and that sort of thing. And so their provision came through the offerings of the people that were brought to the tabernacle, all right? So there's a portion for the Lord, portion for the priest, and then there was a portion that would be left for the family that's offering sacrifice. And what they would do is they would have an offering meal. So they would cook it and participate in eating that meal, and it was a way of them demonstrating fellowship with God and identifying with the sacrifice. It's kind of like when we do communion. We take the bread and the cup, and it's a picture of us identifying. And Jesus talked about eat my flesh, eat my body. Well, he was talking about the Lord's Supper, okay, what it represents, okay? Same thing was going on there. So what's happening here is this thing with the flesh hook and this pot is when the offering meal for the family was being prepared. So here's what the priests were doing. Now remember, they've already gotten their portion. Portion for God, portion for the priest, portion for the family. They've already gotten their portion. Now they're coming along and they're bringing this flesh hook, throwing it into the pot or wherever this stuff is cooking, drawing it out, and whatever that flesh hook would bring out with it, they took that to themselves as well. Not something God had assigned for them to do, right? He's already provided for them. Then it goes on and says, verse 15, so it didn't end there. Here's something else they did. Also, before they burned the fat, this is dealing with the burnt offering for the Lord, okay? Before they would burn the fat, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who sacrificed, give me meat for roasting to the priest, for he will not take boiled meat from you, but raw. So in other words, what they were doing is this. The portion that was going to be offered to God in burnt sacrifice, they were saying, give me part of what is God's sacrifice, and I want it raw. Now, why do you think they would want it raw? So think about this. If it's already been boiled, or if it's already been put over fire, you're kind of limited in your choices about what you can do with it, right? Okay? So what they wanted was to take the meat raw, probably so they could go out, either consume it and fillet it however they wanted it for themselves, saute it, or sell it and pocket the money. You see what they're doing? Now, kind of reminds you of some of these carnal, greedy televangelists and stuff that you see that are constantly milking the people. I heard a man tell me one time he went into a church, and I won't say anything about denomination, race, or anything of that nature. He said he went in because he was asked to go and consult about some insurance or something. And this pastor gets up in front of the congregation. Now, this was a poor congregation, lower class, lower middle class at best congregation, okay, not very large. And the pastor gets up in front of the people and says to them, God told me while I was praying that the church is to buy me a Rolex watch. Yeah, seriously. And guess what they did? They bought him a Rolex watch. That's what you call fleecing the flock, right? That's what you call taking what's not yours, whether it be through force or manipulation or whatever. That's on the scale of some of what was going on right here with these guys. So remember, so he's going up and he's saying, before you put that on the altar to burn it, you give me some raw. Then look at verse 16. And if the man said to him, they should really burn the fat first, then you may take as much as your heart desires, he would answer him. Now this is the servant of the priest answering this man who would object. Because this man objecting knew what you're doing is wrong. And so the servant of the priest would say, no, but you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force. Now, so what does that convey about how Hophni and Phinehas were behaving themselves? What would you call that? Greedy. But what's he threatening? He's threatening violence, intimidation. So you kind of see the things that are going on. So we've got two offenses. First of all, they don't know the Lord. They're not saved, and they act like they're not saved, right? Secondly, they stole what was offered to the Lord. Verse 17 goes on and says, therefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord. Now look at this. So it says, their sin was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. What does that mean? What's that saying was the attitude of the people? Because of the way Hophni and Phinehas were behaving themselves at the tabernacle and at the altar and doing these kinds of things, what was the attitude and response of the people? The what? Well, they didn't like it. They didn't want to come and offer. They didn't come and worship God. They didn't come and make their offerings. It says they abhorred the offering of the Lord. The idea being is this: don't mind going to the temple and offering a sacrifice to the Lord, but if I got to deal with that in order to get to the place of being able to work, not worth it. And so the thing is that their greed, their violence, threats of violence, their intimidation made others not want to come and worship God at the tabernacle. Yes, sir.
Wouldn't that be the same as stealing from God's portion of the sacrifice? I mean, they're supposed to be sacrificing to the Lord. Now they're taking
Yeah.
God's sacrifice and doing something else.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're doing. That's the offense. The question was what their actions, isn't that essentially taking what belongs to God? Yes, the answer is absolutely. And not only were they taking what belongs to the Lord that was not theirs to take, okay, and that's bad enough, but the end result of it is that they were causing people not to even want to come to the house of God and worship the Lord. Pam?
Like even today, you hear people say, I'm not going to that church because all they want's my money.
Well, that's true. Some people will say, I'm not going to that church because all they want is my money.
Yeah, they're saying, I don't want to go there because all those priests just want as many for themselves.
When it's overdone, that can certainly be the case. Yes. And so so their actions were causing people to not even come and worship God. Okay? So you see, so that's two offenses. I said there are three. We'll get to the third in just a minute, okay? So look at, then there's Samuel. Because remember, here's what's happening. There's a contrast here between the sons of Eli and Samuel. So in verses 18 through 21, you see contrasted with the sons of Eli, the purity of Samuel. Okay, so look at verse 18. But Samuel ministered before the Lord, even as a child, wearing a linen ephod. And so in contrast to the character of Eli's evil sons, you see here this young child. Now, Eli was probably a few years older now as things had progressed, okay? And somebody might say, well, wait a minute. These are grown men. Yeah, they're evil, wicked men, but this is a child. That's the point. The contrast is the point. Because at no point does God want any of his people acting like those guys. What does he really want? He wants us to have the simplicity and the innocence of a child, even as an adult. And that had completely been lost on Hophni and Phinehas. I mean, they basically had their own organization, their mob going on, and that sort of thing. And they thought they could get away with whatever they wanted and yet still claim to be priests. And so the contrast is intentional. Even though Samuel is still a child, even if he's 10, even if he's 12, it is intentional. Jesus had something to say about that. In Matthew chapter 18, listen to what Jesus said. He said, at that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, who then is the greatest in the kingdom in heaven? Is that the way Jesus wants his disciples to think? Who among us is the greatest? I'll tell you what, let's do. Let's go ahead, let's have a debate right here tonight. Which among us here are the greatest? Okay? Which of us are the greatest of Hixson First? Okay? You say, that's stupid. Exactly. That's completely missing the point, isn't it? And so when the disciples came, and basically we know it really was led ultimately by James and John, and stimulated, moved on by their mama wanting to promote the boys, okay? That's really what was going on. Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? How did Jesus deal with it at that point? Verse 2 says this, then Jesus called, of all things, a little child to him. Now here's the thing you got to remember. Even though children were valued in that culture, a little child had no authority, no influence, no say. But who does Jesus choose to show his disciples the kind of heart and attitude they ought to have? A little child. And so he calls a little child to him and set him in the midst of them, and he said, assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. So the contrast between Samuel as a child and Hophni and Phinehas as adult men is poignant, but it's also intended. Hophni and Phinehas should have been more like Samuel. In fact, think about this. It's because Hophni and Phinehas were the kind of men that they were. That's part of the reason why God raised up a Samuel. Had Hophni and Phinehas been the men they should have been, God may never have had to even raise up a Samuel. Verse number 19 goes on, and we're given an update, by the way, here on Hannah and Elkanah. And because remember, they'd been married for years. Remember I said a week or two ago, there was Hannah and Peninnah, the two wives. Remember which one was most likely the first wife and the true love of Elkanah's life? Who was it? Hannah. The only reason why Peninnah was in the picture was because Hannah couldn't have children. So they'd been married for years. Because you read the account, Peninnah's got lots of kids. She'd been having kids for many, many years, all right? And so years had passed. They'd never had any children. Finally, Samuel comes along. Then we read in verse number 19. Moreover, his mother used to make him a little robe and bring it to him year by year when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. So that's how frequently Hannah got to see Samuel, was on an annual basis, and she'd bring him a robe because she knew he's grown since last year, so she's bringing him a new robe. And he goes on and says, and Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, the Lord give you descendants from this woman for the loan that was given to the Lord. What's the loan? And remember that term loan, and when she says lend or lent to, means given back, dedicated to God, okay? And so the Lord give you descendants from this woman for the loan that was given to the Lord. Then they would go to their own home, and the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. There's a good example. You can't outgive God. Amen? You can't outgive God. And meanwhile, so here's another statement about Samuel, because really that's kind of where the focus is. Meanwhile, the child Samuel grew before the Lord. What does that mean? What does it mean he grew before the Lord? What does that mean? Do what? Well, he's growing up. He's maturing. He's getting older. What else? Yeah, he's growing spiritually. That could never be said about Eli's sons. You can't grow in the Lord if you don't know the Lord, right? Okay, here's the third offense that we find of Eli's sons. In verse 22, they committed sexual immorality. Now, Eli was very old. We made comment about that earlier, so really no condition to lead Israel as high priest. And he heard everything his sons did to, listen, everything his sons did to all Israel. Now remember, this stuff was going on where? In Shiloh, where the tabernacle is located, right? So when it says that his sons did this to all Israel, what does that mean? It meant everybody who came to the tabernacle was subjected to this treatment of Hophni and Phinehas. And that meant, listen, that more and more were coming to the conclusion, I'm not going back. I'm not dealing with that. And so it says, and he heard everything that his sons did to all Israel, and listen to this, and how they lay with women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And so as I was thinking about that, here's what I suspect was going on. There may have been some questionable women coming around that it was not hard to convince, but it may be, listen, here's what we've seen with Hophni and Phinehas. Most of what they're doing is extortion. It was by force, it was by manipulation. There is a good, and here's kind of where I am on this. It is very likely that what they were doing was using their position of authority to intimidate women to engage in sexual immorality with them or else. It's bad enough if it was just women who were casually participating, but more than likely, it was more extortion. Okay? And then, and by the way, however it was happening, regardless, it's unconscionable to think that something like that would be done at the door of the tabernacle. Any reasonable person would understand that. That just kind of gives you an idea of just what kind of scoundrels these guys were. I mean, when we go back to that phrase that they were sons of Belial, which mean wicked and worthless men, you get the point. Now in verses 23 through 26, we see a critical issue here, Eli's failure to properly address his sons. So he said to them, why do you do such things? Now let me ask you a question. It doesn't matter why they do these things. The problem is that they are doing it. That's the problem. Okay? So he's really asking the wrong question here. They can't excuse their sin. There's no excuse for it at all. And so they needed to be held responsible for what was going on. He says, for I hear of your evil dealings from all the people. Know, my sons, for it is not a good report that I hear you make the Lord's people transgress. So now let me ask you a question. So when you see what Eli is doing as he is addressing this thing, what is Eli? What seems to be his approach to solving the problem? What's the only thing he's doing? That's what he ought to do. All he's doing is talking. He's not doing anything. This is a situation that requires action. And by the way, he's the high priest. He's got the authority. Plus, he's their father. He's got the authority and the responsibility to do it. And so it's bad enough that they've done all the things that they've done and so forth and so on. But in the end, again, they are also causing people to stumble and not come to the house of God to worship. He goes on and he says, if one man sins against another, God will judge him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who's going to intercede for him? Nevertheless, they did not heed the voice of the Father because the Lord desired to kill them. So there's two things here. First of all, Eli was proving himself to be unfaithful in refusing to firmly and directly address. Here's what Eli should have done. He should have dealt with his two sons the same way he would have dealt with other young men who would have been priests but who were not his sons, and he should have dealt with them the same way that he may have dealt with others. He was being too soft. This was not a time for soft peddling. He needed to deal with this situation because, it was epidemic. It was affecting the entire system of tabernacle worship and the people not wanting to worship. And so he failed miserably. And so he should have dealt with it. Yes?
I wonder how Samuel got instructed in that kind of system. How did he become aware and have knowledge of the Lord?
Well, I'm sure that the way that Samuel came to know, he was born a priest. He was born in the lineage of a priest, and he would have had the raising of a priest and the teaching and the training of a Jewish boy and young man, and then, of course, obviously at a point come to a place of personal faith and knowledge in the Lord. So that's how he got there. The problem was this. The problem was that Samuel was failing in his responsibilities as a father, and he was failing in his responsibility as a religious leader, as the high priest of Israel. Eli, what did I say? Samuel, Eli. Okay? He was failing. And here's the thing. Hello? Here's the thing, all right? Listen. He was failing the Lord. He was failing his sons. He's failing the people. It was just not a good situation. And so look, then it goes on and tells us, but they did not heed their father's words. First of all, I don't think they took their father seriously. I think he had let this kind of stuff go for so long. Okay? But then it also says they didn't heed their father's words because the Lord intended to kill them. He was done with it. They had crossed the line, and it's very similar. It's like we've talked about in Revelation. We talk about Pharaoh. They'd crossed the line where they had hardened their heart so much against God. God was going to harden their heart, and he wasn't going to give them a chance at repentance. Yes, sir.
You think, in that case, the Bible talks about giving much responsibility. When you give responsibility to people in high places like that, he expects a lot and he punishes them more harshly. It seemed like he was in a position to really affect a lot of people in Israel.
Well, the question the question is that Eli, being in the position he's in with great responsibility and authority, he was responsible for using that, and that's correct. And yes, he did have, and he did affect people, but in the wrong way, negatively, because he let this stuff go on with his two sons. He hurt the whole system, everybody, because Eli failed to act.
Even though he wasn't doing it personally, he was more or less condoning it by not doing it.
Exactly. They're under his authority, and that's part of his responsibility. I'll be honest with you. Listen, let me tell you something. I've said this before. As a pastor, I've had to deal with multiple things, and there have been times I've had to deal with situations and people and individuals that didn't go over well. People got upset. It was plain as day that they were guilty of this or that, but I've said it many, many times. I'm not going to. They're my friend, so I've got to defend them, and I got to stand with them. Let me tell you, if your friend is wrong, your friend is wrong. I can't tell you how many times I've had to deal with that. And people who the Sunday before I had to deal with it or whenever, Brother Steve, we just love you. You're just the most wonderful thing. Well, you're the best thing since sliced bread. Then I was moldy. I was molded bread after I deal with the issue. It's just the fickleness of people. It just blows your mind. All right. So then we come back to, again, this contrast with Samuel. Look at verse 26. We see Samuel's ongoing spiritual growth again, okay? And the child Samuel grew in stature, a very similar term of Jesus in the Gospels, and in favor with both the Lord and men, almost an identical statement about Jesus' growth and development. I mean, so you can see Samuel's in pretty good company right here, all right? He's, and again, there's this stark contrast between Samuel. And so by this time, Samuel's getting a little bit older, but he's growing, he's maturing as a young man, he's growing spiritually, he's growing intellectually, and on every level and so forth. And even as probably as an early teen, maybe by this point, or still just a child and so forth, by this stage in his life, he's got more weight and substance to himself than Eli's sons, the two of them put together. And maybe even including Eli. Which leads us to God's judgment on Eli's house. And in verses 27 through 33, we see it being pronounced. It says, "Then a man of God came to Eli and said to him, 'Thus says the Lord, did I not clearly reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt in Pharaoh's house?'" So he's talking about Aaron, okay? Aaron is where that lineage of priests begins. Aaron was the first priest there. And so Eli is a descendant of Aaron. And he says, "Did I not choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to offer upon my altar burnt incense, to wear an ephod before me? And did I not give the house of your father all the offerings of the children of Israel made by fire?" In other words, did I not put the responsibility of handling these sacrifices properly into the care of your father and all of his descendants, including you? The answer is obviously yes. Then look at this. "Why did you kick at my sacrifice and my offering, which I have commanded in my dwelling place, and honor your sons before me, to make yourselves fat with the best of all the offerings of Israel, my people?" So you see what God says? So here's the thing you could say, all right, Eli wasn't doing this stuff, but his sons were. But because he chose to honor his sons over God, God says, you just kicked at my offering like it's just a common thing, like it's nothing. And by the way, even though Eli's sons were the one perpetrating these things, I suppose Eli was probably getting somewhat of a kickback from it, more than likely from them as well. Verse 30. "Therefore the Lord God of Israel says, I said indeed that your house and the house of your father would walk before me forever." So in other words, he said, the house of Aaron, his descendants, and of course he was talking about Eli and your house, but he says, "Now the Lord says, far be it from me, for those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed." And there's a verse of scripture I use oftentimes in counseling with people. Listen, you honor him, he'll honor you. Amen? He'll prove it every single time. Listen to verse 31. "The days are coming that I will cut off your arm and the arm of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house." Now, God's not cutting off the line of Aaron. He's cutting off the line of Eli from that point on. Any more descendants of Eli, all right? Verse 32, "And you will see now listen to this statement, and you will see an enemy in my dwelling place, despite all the good which God does for Israel." In other words, God is saying to Eli, I am going to be your enemy. You chose to honor your sons over me rather than to honor me. I'm making myself your enemy. "And there shall not be an old man in your house forever, but any of your men whom I do not cut off from my altar, shall consume your eyes and grieve your heart, and all the descendants of your house shall die in the flower of their age. The men in your family aren't even going to live to be old men. They're going to die young. So that's pronouncement. Then he gives him a sign and a promise of it. Verse 34. This shall be a sign that will come upon your 2 sons. In other words, he's saying, here's how you can know you take me seriously. Here's what's going to happen. Here's the sign. This is what will come upon your 2 sons, on Hophni and Phinehas. In one day they shall die, both of them, and we'll see that later. Then I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind, and I will build him a sure house, and he will walk before my anointed forever. And so those words are partially fulfilled in Samuel, later in Zadok the priest during the days of Solomon, because he will be the one that ultimately replaces the line of Eli, and ultimately the promise is fulfilled in Jesus. Verse 36 says this, and it shall come to pass that everyone who is left in your house will come and bow down to him for a piece of silver and a morsel of bread, and say, please put me in one of the priestly positions that I may eat a piece of bread. Now, what a fitting judgment for the house of Eli, because his sons were so motivated by greed that God says, your descendants are all going to be beggars. So you talk about a generational curse. That was a generational curse that doesn't come to an end. So, we'll see those things further fulfilled as we go along. So that brings us to the end of chapter 2. All right, so any questions? Any other questions, thoughts, Don?
Hannah had to be aware of this situation of the temple. So it was a lot harder for her to give up Samuel to put him in this arena and know what was going on.
True.
And of course, visiting every year, she saw all the drama and stuff going on.
So did Hannah.
Do what?
Yeah.
Yeah. This-
A lot of Samuel, I think, although he was, like I say, was young, it shows how much an influence she had on him as a child.
yes.
That it was able to carry over through this mess that he was put in.
Well, and that's what we've talked about is that the years the short time that she had him, she put a lot into Samuel, because that really was the foundation of everything that we've read even so far this evening. And so the comment being made was that the decision for Hannah and Elkanah to give Eli, or to give Samuel to the Lord, but putting him into the care of Eli, they knew about all these things going on. And that made the challenge even greater. But that also underscores, I believe, the fact that they knew God had a plan for Samuel. Because this was you remember the comment that I shared first week when we were talking about the women in the scriptures, Sarah and others down to Hannah and so forth, Rebecca, that they were barren. But when they became pregnant, that pregnancy was pregnant with meaning, that God was at work in a very unique way. And I think that they realized that with Samuel. Although it couldn't have made it any easier. But they knew that God was at work. Okay? All right, we are going to conclude with that. Everybody have a great evening, and thank you for joining us online. God bless.